Most people don't notice rent seeking when they first encounter it. They notice something else first: friction, small fees, delays. A strange feeling that everything around them is becoming more expensive, more complicated, and somehow less useful at the same time. You pay service fees to buy a concert ticket online. You pay subscriptions to access software you used to own permanently. Rent rises faster than salaries even when the apartment looks exactly the same as it did 5 years ago. At first, these feel like isolated annoyances, separate problems, separate industries. But after a while, a pattern starts to appear. The system seems to reward the people who control access more than the people who create value. And once you see that pattern, it becomes difficult to stop seeing it. This is where a lot of people quietly begin to lose trust in modern systems, not because they think the world is collapsing, but because something underneath everyday life feels increasingly artificial. Like the economy is still moving forward on the surface, while underneath, more and more energy is being spent extracting value instead of creating it. If you are in your 20s or 30s, you have probably felt this pressure already. You work harder than people expected you to. You learn skills. You optimize your resume. Maybe you build content online or start a small business, and yet the feeling remains strangely unstable. The rules never feel fully visible. The harder you push, the more invisible layers seem to appear between effort and reward. Platforms take percentages. Algorithms decide visibility. Housing absorbs income faster than productivity grows. Entire industries seem designed around gatekeeping rather than usefulness. This is not just frustration, it is recognition. Especially for people who spend time around self-improvement, finance, or deep thinking podcasts, because eventually the same question appears everywhere. Why does modern life feel so optimized and so inefficient at the same time? Why does it feel like systems become larger, more profitable, and more technologically advanced, while ordinary people feel increasingly squeezed inside them? At first, this looks like poor management, or greed, or corruption. But those explanations are too shallow. Something more structural is happening underneath. Creators notice this pattern earlier than most people, because platforms make the mechanism visible. A creator can spend weeks producing something valuable, useful, or original, and still disappear inside distribution systems they do not control. The audience exists. The demand exists. The work exists. But visibility does not belong to the creator. It belongs to the platform. This is where many people begin to understand a deeper economic reality. Controlling the road is often more profitable than building the destination. And once a system reaches enough scale, ownership of access becomes extraordinarily powerful. Not because the gatekeeper necessarily creates proportional value each time money moves through the system, but because everyone else depends on passing through the gate. The same pattern appears far outside the internet, in healthcare systems full of administrative layers, in universities where tuition rises faster than educational outcomes, in industries where paperwork, compliance, and intermediaries multiply faster than actual production. At first, these layers appear useful. Then they become permanent. Then they begin feeding themselves. This is where the system slowly shifts from creation toward extraction, and most people feel the effects long before they learn the name for it. That pattern has a name: rent-seeking. The term sounds technical at first, but the mechanism itself is simple. Rent-seeking happens when money is made primarily through controlling access to value instead of creating new value directly. A productive system rewards improvement, better tools, faster delivery, more efficient production. Rent-seeking rewards control, ownership of scarce assets, ownership of platforms, ownership of permissions. Imagine two different people making money from a bridge. The first person builds a bridge where none existed before. Trade improves, transportation becomes easier, new economic activity appears, that is productive value creation. The second person buys the only bridge connecting two cities and raises toll prices every year because nobody has an alternative route. The bridge itself does not improve. The owner simply controls access. This is where the distinction begins. Not all profit is rent-seeking. Profit can come from solving problems. But systems become dangerous when extracting value becomes easier than producing value. Because once that happens, incentives begin to drift, slowly at first, then everywhere at once. At first, rent-seeking often hides behind efficiency. Platforms centralize distribution. Administrative systems standardize processes. Large companies simplify fragmented markets. And initially, this works. Friction decreases, convenience increases, people benefit. But then something subtle changes. The system discovers that controlling access can scale faster than improving outcomes. This is where incentives begin to distort. Apple and Google created enormous value through smartphones and app ecosystems. But over time, developers became dependent on app stores to reach users at all. The platform no longer just enabled commerce, it controlled the gate. The same thing happens in housing markets. Building homes creates value. But once housing becomes scarce enough, simply owning existing property can become more profitable than creating new supply. The system starts rewarding ownership over production. Control over improvement. This is not always intentional. That is what makes it dangerous. Systems drift toward whatever behavior generates the strongest incentives. And controlling bottlenecks is often easier than solving difficult problems, especially once competition weakens, especially once dependency grows. This is where modern economies begin slowing down without appearing broken on the surface. Ticketmaster is one of the clearest examples because almost everyone has experienced it directly. The original promise was simple: make ticket distribution more efficient. Instead of standing in physical lines for hours, people could buy tickets digitally. At first, this created real value. But once the platform became deeply embedded into the live entertainment industry, the source of power changed. The business no longer depended only on helping people buy tickets. It depended on controlling access to tickets. This is where things start to shift. Fees multiply. Competition weakens. Consumers become trapped between exclusive venue contracts and centralized distribution systems. And the strange part is that everyone involved often dislikes the system simultaneously. Fans hate the fees. Artists complain about pricing structures. Even venues sometimes resent the dependency. But the mechanism continues because the gate itself became valuable, not the service. The control. This is one of the signatures of rent-seeking systems. They survive not because people love them, but because escaping them becomes difficult. The more centralized the system becomes, the more leverage the gatekeeper accumulates. Eventually, controlling the infrastructure becomes more profitable than improving the experience itself. The American healthcare system operates through a similar dynamic, although on a much larger scale. Most people assume healthcare costs are high because medicine is advanced or doctors are overpaid. But a large percentage of healthcare spending does not go toward treatment directly. It disappears into administrative layers: insurance processing, billing departments, negotiation systems, compliance management. Entire industries exist primarily to navigate the complexity created by other industries. At first, each layer appears reasonable in isolation: more regulation, more verification, more optimization. But over time, the system begins consuming enormous amounts of energy simply managing itself. This is where modern institutions become strange. Complexity stops functioning as protection and starts functioning as extraction. Most patients cannot explain what procedures cost beforehand. Hospitals often cannot explain clearly either. Prices become opaque. Paperwork multiplies. And the more confusing the system becomes, the easier it is for extraction to hide inside it. This is not necessarily because individuals inside the system are malicious. In many cases, they are responding rationally to incentives. But systems do not need evil intentions to produce inefficient outcomes. They only need incentives that reward control more consistently than value creation. Housing markets reveal another uncomfortable version of the same pattern. Building housing is difficult. It requires labor, materials, planning, and long-term investment. But once supply becomes restricted enough, ownership itself starts generating extraordinary returns, especially in major cities where demand continues rising faster than construction. This creates a subtle inversion inside the economy. The highest rewards no longer flow toward building new value. They flow toward controlling existing scarcity. At first, rising housing prices look like prosperity. Homeowners feel wealthier. Investors celebrate appreciating assets. Cities attract capital. But underneath, something begins tightening. Younger generations spend larger percentages of income on rent. Workers become less mobile because relocation becomes too expensive. Entire regions slowly transform from productive environments into extraction environments. The economy still appears active on the surface. Construction cranes still move. Luxury buildings still rise. But much of the energy is no longer expanding opportunity. It is competing over access to limited assets. This is where systems become psychologically exhausting. People continue working harder, yet more of their effort disappears into maintaining access to things that already exist. Housing, education, healthcare, platforms. The game shifts from creation to permission. Large technology platforms accelerated this transition because digital systems scale faster than physical ones. The internet originally looked like a decentralizing force. Anyone could build. Anyone could publish. Anyone could reach an audience directly. And for a while, this was partially true. But network effects changed the structure underneath. The more users gathered on a platform, the more valuable the platform became. And the more valuable it became, the harder it became to leave. Creators experience this very directly. A YouTuber may build millions of views, but the audience relationship is still mediated by recommendation systems they do not control. An Amazon seller can build an entire business while remaining dependent on marketplace algorithms, rankings, and fee structures. App developers rely on app stores to access smartphone users at all. At first, platforms enable growth, then they become infrastructure, then they become unavoidable. This is where the balance of power changes quietly. The creator appears independent on the surface, but distribution belongs to the platform. Visibility belongs to the platform. Access belongs to the platform. The more economic activity flows through centralized systems, the more profitable gatekeeping becomes. Not because gatekeepers produce all the value themselves, but because they control the paths through which value must travel. Corporate bureaucracy often follows the same trajectory internally. Companies begin with clear goals, build products, solve problems, grow efficiently. In early stages, contribution is usually visible. The relationship between effort and output feels direct. But as organizations expand, new layers appear. Reporting structures, approval chains, internal metrics. Management systems designed to measure productivity gradually become systems designed to preserve themselves. At first, this looks like coordination. Then it scales. Then something begins breaking underneath. Employees spend increasing amounts of time optimizing presentations, meetings, and KPI visibility instead of improving actual output. Entire careers emerge around managing organizational complexity rather than creating external value. This is where institutions quietly become self-protective. Not because people inside them are irrational, but because large systems naturally reward behaviors that maintain influence and reduce personal risk. The safest strategy inside many organizations is no longer producing the most value. It is controlling information flow, managing perception, and avoiding blame. Over time, the institution starts consuming more energy internally than externally. From the outside, it still looks productive. Revenue exists, offices operate, reports circulate. But underneath, the system is slowly redirecting resources towards self-maintenance rather than creation. What makes rent-seeking dangerous is not just the money involved. It is the direction incentives begin pushing entire societies over time. Because once controlling systems becomes more profitable than improving systems, capital starts flowing differently. Talent starts flowing differently. Ambition itself changes direction. The smartest people in a society stop asking, "What can I build?" and start asking, "What can I control?" This is where economies begin slowing down without fully realizing it. Building new technology is risky. Creating better infrastructure is difficult. Scientific progress takes time. But owning bottlenecks is stable. Owning land in constrained cities. Owning financial infrastructure. Owning platforms. Owning intellectual property portfolios. The more uncertainty grows, the more attractive extraction becomes compared to creation. At first, this shift is subtle. Then entire industries begin reorganizing around it. More resources move toward optimization, litigation, administration, and asset protection. Less toward production. Less toward experimentation. Less toward long-term innovation. The economy still generates enormous numbers on paper. Market valuations rise. GDP continues moving. But underneath, more and more energy is being spent redistributing existing value instead of generating new value. This is where stagnation begins hiding inside apparent growth. This pattern appears repeatedly throughout history because it emerges naturally from scale. Every successful system eventually accumulates layers designed to protect itself. Empires do this. Corporations do this. Platforms do this. Governments do this. At first, rules exist to coordinate growth. Then they begin preserving incumbents. Then they begin slowing adaptation itself. The more powerful a system becomes, the more incentive it has to defend existing advantages. This is why rent-seeking often grows strongest in mature economies rather than developing ones. Early-stage systems reward builders because there is still enormous value left to create. But once major infrastructure already exists, competition increasingly shifts toward controlling access to that infrastructure. This is where regulatory capture starts appearing. Large companies influence regulations that smaller competitors cannot survive. Licensing systems expand, legal complexity increases, compliance costs rise, and each individual rule often appears reasonable by itself. That is what makes the process difficult to notice in real time. Nobody wakes up one morning and decides to freeze innovation intentionally. The system drifts there gradually, one layer at a time, one protection mechanism at a time, until eventually the cost of participating becomes so high that fewer people can meaningfully compete at all. Complexity plays a critical role in this process because complexity hides extraction. A simple system exposes inefficiency quickly. A complicated system can bury it for decades. This is why some of the most profitable industries are also some of the hardest for ordinary people to fully understand. Telecom contracts, financial products, healthcare billing, tax systems, administrative consulting. The more difficult a system becomes to navigate, the more valuable intermediaries become. And once intermediaries become economically powerful, they gain incentives to preserve the complexity that justifies their existence. This is where systems begin feeding themselves. Not through conspiracy, through incentive alignment. At first, complexity appears because the world genuinely becomes larger and more interconnected. Then entire industries emerge around managing that complexity. Then reducing complexity itself becomes economically threatening to the people benefiting from it. This creates a strange inversion where simplification becomes disruptive, even when everyone claims to want efficiency. You can see this in corporate environments constantly adding tools, meetings, dashboards, and management layers, while productivity barely improves proportionally. The system starts measuring activity instead of outcomes, coordination instead of usefulness. At first, this feels like optimization. Then something subtle changes. The structure begins protecting itself more aggressively than the value it originally existed to create. The psychological consequences of this are difficult to measure, but people feel them constantly. Burnout is part of it. Cynicism is part of it. A growing sense that effort and reward are no longer clearly connected. Many people feel trapped inside systems that demand increasing levels of optimization just to maintain stability. More credentials, more networking, more applications, more subscriptions, more metrics, more performance tracking. The more technologically advanced society becomes, the more exhausting ordinary life sometimes feels. And this creates confusion because modern systems still produce extraordinary conveniences. Smartphones work, food arrives instantly, information moves globally in seconds. On the surface, the system appears hyper-efficient. But underneath, many people quietly feel that they are running harder simply to remain in place. This is where trust begins eroding. Not necessarily because people reject markets or institutions entirely, but because they start sensing that the visible rules are no longer the real rules. The system says it rewards productivity, yet ownership often outperforms contribution. It says it rewards innovation, yet incumbents frequently dominate through control rather than improvement. The contradiction becomes difficult to ignore once enough people experience it personally. A healthy economy tends to reward people who solve problems. A stagnant economy increasingly rewards people who position themselves between other people and the solutions they already need. That distinction matters more than most political arguments because it changes how society allocates energy itself. In productive systems, success usually expands capability. Better tools lower costs. Better infrastructure increases mobility. Better technology creates new opportunities. But in extractive systems, success often increases dependency. More subscriptions, more fees, more locked ecosystems, more gatekeepers. The economy continues growing numerically while becoming heavier structurally. This is why some societies begin feeling simultaneously advanced and exhausted. Wealth exists, but friction exists everywhere too. Innovation exists, but access narrows. Convenience increases, but autonomy decreases. At first, these tensions appear unrelated. Then the pattern becomes visible. The system is no longer optimized primarily around creating value. It is increasingly optimized around capturing value flows after they already exist. And once systems reach that stage, reversing the process becomes extremely difficult, because the people benefiting most from the structure also possess the greatest power to preserve it.